Hi everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you've just found this place, then welcome. And if you're returning, I'm glad to have you back. I'm Alex, and this is my channel where we explore and theory craft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons. Today we are doing one of our quick builds where we'll be exploring a briefly summarized character build for Dungeons & Dragons. And as always with our quick builds, if there's ever a build you'd like to see me explore in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments below. Today's concept comes from Billy Rigby 4839. Who asked to see a Talenta Halfling Barbarian/Fighter multi-class build based on the Talenta Halflings from the Eberron setting. There were no restrictions, we could use any source book, and I did go back and double check, and we're actually going to use 2024 rules for this build as well, since there are a lot of new things that could make this build a little bit more interesting. Now, the one thing that I'm going to try and get out of the way really quick is the Clawfoot mount. In the lore of Eberron, Talenta Halflings are generally nomadic people, I believe, that have a bond with these clawfoot creatures. They are essentially velociraptors, I believe, but they are certainly dinosaurs that are fast, agile, and have clawed feet. The reason I bring this up is because I am not going to be baking in a clawfoot mount into the build. But I am going to be assuming that we're going to pick one up and sort of picking a few features that help with us being mounted. The reason for this is because if we wanted to actually bake in a Clawfoot mount, that would be going something such as Beastmaster Ranger or some other class that gets an actual pet, and having that class added onto the Barbarian Fighter that already exists might be a little more difficult in terms of ability scores and just having the pet scale well, since usually those pets scale based off of your level in the class you got them in. This isn't to say that we couldn't do like a Beastmaster Ranger fighter build. I just wanted to focus more on what can make our Talenta Halfling a powerful and aggressive character, while also assuming that if we're playing a Talenta Halfling, we're probably going to be in the Eberron setting anyways. And I would believe that since it's such a core feature to our character and maybe their backstory, that our DM would help us get access to a Clawfoot mount as well. With all that said though, if you wanted a way to actually bake in a Clawfoot to your class, Beastmaster Ranger, or even Paladin, with Fine Steed now being a core feature instead of just a spell, could both work really well. Other than that though, let's jump on into the build. Starting in character creation with our origin, we are of course a halfling, since we have to be a halfling to be a Talenta Halfling specifically. As a halfling, we get all the regular things that a halfling typically would. We have brave, we have halfling nimbleness, we have luck, and we are naturally stealthy. Looking at our actual origin now, we're gonna go with Outlander from 2014. The reason for this is because Outlander thematically fits the most appropriately in my mind. It lets us feel like a nomadic wanderer that isn't necessarily a hermit living on their own, but is rather part of some sort of tribal nomadic culture that isn't going to be your typical civilized nation, at least not in Eberron. Also, there actually isn't really an Outlander type background in 2024. Wayfarer, which might be close, is more similar to the Urchin background, and Guide, which is technically the closest, is skewed to be more of like a magical guide where you get Magic Initiate Druid as your origin feat. That's not really something that we need or even want for this build. So with Outlander, we can pick any origin feat we like. I'm personally going to go with Tough, though you could pick any that is your favorite. And we can also improve any 2 ability scores by a 2 and a 1, or 3 ability scores by 1 each. We're going to go with a 2 and a 1, putting the 2 into Strength and the 1 into Constitution. With that said, we're going to want the following stats. We're going to want 17 Strength by putting 9 points into it, getting a 15 and a +2 to get it to 17. We're going to take 13 Dexterity just by putting 5 points into that. And then we're also going to get 16 Constitution by putting 9 points into it and our +1. Intelligence and Charisma, we're going to leave both alone at 8, but we're going to put our last 4 points into Wisdom to get it to 12. Obviously, you can exchange some of those stats if you would prefer to divvy them out in a different way, but for us, that's what we're going with. Jumping into the actual level breakdown build now, we're going to look at the 4 tiers of play and just briefly summarize what we're getting at each tier. Starting with Tier 1, we're going to be a Barbarian 4 and Fighter 1. You can start with either one that you would like to, but no matter what, we probably want more barbarian levels than fighter levels, at least for the first little bit. Here, we're going to be getting things like rage, weapon mastery right away, which does matter for us. In my mind, we're going to want to take 2 light melee weapons and have at least one of them be a scimitar. I think for the sake of the build as presented, I'm just going to assume both are a scimitar, so we don't have to do too many mental gymnastics. But of course, you could pick any 2 light weapons that you like, and we probably want the nick mastery as well to make sure that we can have 2 attacks with our attack action right off the bat, which pairs really well with rage. We also get unarmored defense, but we'd probably rather use a sort of medium armor for the time being. We also get danger sense and reckless attack is going to be amazing because we're going to have a lot of attacks. Danger sense at level 2 is also a really good feature now since it got a nice buff, where we now just have flat advantage on dexterity saving throws unless we're incapacitated. At level 3 we get a couple things like primal knowledge as well as our barbarian subclass. Looking at our barbarian subclass, I think for this one we're going to want to be a wild heart. Wild Heart, in my mind, fits with the whole idea of the Talenta Halflings having a bond or kinship with the various dinosaur beasts of the Talenta Plains. And we can reflavor the animal spirit totems to be animals like the Clawfoot that are native to the plains. There is bear, eagle, and wolf. I would probably theme this to have wolf be a clawfoot, whereas the bear could be reflavored to be a more defensive dinosaur-esque creature. Either of these are good choices. Eagle is also okay, but it's not necessarily one of the best ones for us. If we pick wolf, we'll be more aggressive and offensive focused with a nice support feature, given that any time we're raging and are next to an enemy, all of our allies have advantage on attack rolls against that enemy. They can be melee attack rolls, ranged attack rolls, or spell attack rolls, and that is a really nice buff. Bear is also really tempting because even though it's not as powerful as the 2014 Bear Totem Barbarian, it does give us extra resistance on top of the resistance we get from rage, and that can make us very defensive and could come in handy later. I'll leave the choice up to you, but either of those 2 options are pretty good. Finally, for our little dip into fighter, which we can take at any point in time during these first 5 levels, we're going to get the fighting style 2-weapon fighting, so we can actually add our strength modifier as well as our rage modifier to our extra nick attack. And then we also get second wind, as well as a few more weapon masteries. The actual one last thing to mention about tier 1 is our first feat. Like I said, I'm not building the Clawfoot into the build itself, but I am going to take features that account for it and let us assume that we are going to be mounted at least some of the time. And to get that, we are going to take Mounted Combatant here. Mounted Combatant lets us increase our strength by 1 to get to 18, so it's not completely useless if we aren't mounted, but if we are, then we get all the good benefits we got in the 2014 version. We have advantage on creatures smaller than our mount. We have Leap Aside to save our mount from dexterity saving throws, and we have Veer. Anytime an enemy would attack our mount, we can have that attack target us instead. Going on to tier 2 now, we're going to end up being a Barbarian 6 and a Fighter 4. Looking at the Barbarian levels first, they're pretty simple. We get extra attack, as well as fast movement, as well as the next spirit animal / wild heart barbarian feature. That is Aspect of the Wilds, and this allows us to get a utility feature. We can get dark vision through the owl, we can get a climb speed through the panther, and we can get a swim speed through the salmon. I would suggest probably picking owl, as it makes the most sense for a halfling that comes from a plain landscape. There's not a lot for climbing and there's not a lot for swimming, but you can also switch this at the end of every long rest, so it doesn't really matter which one you pick. Going over to Fighter, we are actually getting a few more levels into Fighter now, and we're getting a few good features. Number 1 is Action Surge. We are also going to get our next feat. I'm going to go to the feat first before we go over to the subclass, because the feat is pretty quick and easy. We want the Dual Wielder feat. Because our only bonus action right now is Raging, we want to weaponize our bonus action after we have raged. And getting the Dual Wielder feat allows us to make an extra attack as our bonus action after we have used our attack action to attack with a light weapon, procced light weapon fighting, and of course with Nick, that means we could have 3 attacks with our attack action and a 4th with our bonus action. And now it's time for our Fighter subclass. There is one really good pick, and then there are a lot of other pretty good picks. For the pretty good picks, I have to give honorable mentions to the new Champion and the new Battle Master, since they would just let us play with some new and revised features. The Battle Master is pretty much the same, but a lot of their maneuvers got reworked or changed or buffed to some regard, so that could be pretty fun if you want to be a little bit more tactical with your character. If you wanted to be a pure angry halfling, going Champion can give you that increased crit chance, and you still get a couple extra tactical options, and will eventually get an extra fighting style too, so that could all make for a pretty interesting yet simplified character. The other two options though, and the one we're going with, are both from 2014. I have to shout out Samurai, since it got a bit of a shadow buff thanks to the Nick weapon mastery. It used to be that being a samurai would conflict with a dual wielder, since you could not dual wield and use fighting spirit on the same turn. Now you can, and if we wanted to, we still could. We could pick up Samurai, get fighting spirit, gain temporary hit points that stack really well with Barbarian Rage, and dual wield on the same turn that we use fighting spirit, have free advantage without reckless attack, and it would be a pretty nice combo. A nicer combo though is Cavalier. Cavalier gives us some small bonuses to mounted combatant, which is a really good reason why I want it for thematic purposes, but also the Unwavering Mark is actually really strong now as well. Unwavering Mark says that when we hit a creature with a melee weapon attack, we can mark them, and as long as they are marked and within 5 feet of us, they have disadvantage on all their attack rolls against any target other than us. It's a little taunt feature. The bonus to this feature is that if that enemy were to then attack someone else, we would get a special bonus action attack on our turn against them. They still always have to be within 5 feet of us though. Now the reason this is so good for us is because we have the Nick weapon mastery, as well as the bonus action attack already. This means that we don't have to attack the same enemy to proc the Unwavering Mark, and we can have multiple enemies marked at the same time. So technically, we could run up to a group of 4 enemies, hit all of them once, hopefully, and apply that disadvantage to each one of them. Then, because we're within 5 feet of them, assuming they don't just move away from us, which of course they could do, if they attack us instead, we could A, as a bear Wildheart Barbarian, have a lot of resistance to the damage of the attacks that they'll be dealing, or B, as a Wolfheart Barbarian, we could provide our allies with advantage on all their attack rolls against those enemies, so we will have debuffed the enemies and buffed our allies when fighting them, and that could also be a really good option. All in all, Cavalier I think wins because it's thematically appropriate for us, but also mechanically powerful, especially if you just consider Unwavering Mark as a free sap weapon mastery that gets applied to all your attacks, because it essentially is. Tier 3, we're going to be a Barbarian 8 and Fighter 7, and this is going to end our Barbarian levels for the build. With Barbarian 8, we get another feat, and then we also gain Feral Instinct and Instinctive Pounce. Now, when we use our bonus action on our first turn to rage, we can move up to half our speed for free. That is a nice way to get into combat, though if we're mounted, it won't really work since we're using our speed, not the mount's speed. So it's a very nice feature for when you aren't mounted on your Clawfoot. Feral Instinct though, advantage on initiative rolls, that's always good. Looking at the feats we're going to get from both Fighter 6 as well as Barbarian 8, we probably want both Defensive Duelist and Mage Slayer. Defensive Duelist increases our dexterity by +1, but then it allows us to use our reaction as long as we're holding a finesse weapon, which we have a scimitar, and we can use that finesse weapon to essentially increase our AC. The AC bonus scales off of our proficiency bonus, not our dexterity, even though that's the ability score we improved with the feat. Mage Slayer, on the other hand, lets us improve our strength, and that lets us get it up to 20. But in addition, we have Concentration Breaker, making us very dangerous for enemy spellcasters or creatures that have concentration abilities. And if we're mounted, then we can definitely get to them since we'll have that extra mobility. Also, we have Guarded Mind, and Guarded Mind is really nice for any martial character. If you've seen any of my other 2024 builds, you know that I would say Mage Slayer is pretty much an auto pick on most martial characters, at least if you have extra room in your build. The last thing about Tier 3 is that at Fighter 7, we gain Warding Maneuver. It's going to let us roll a d8, add that number rolled to our AC, and if the attack still hits, it gives us resistance to that attack's damage. Finally, in Tier 4, we're ending off the build as still a Barbarian 8, but now a Fighter 12. We gain 2 more feats from Fighters 8 and 12, and we're just going to increase our Constitution twice from both of those to get us up to 20 Constitution. We're going to gain the Cavalier ability, Hold the Line, which is a built-in mini Sentinel-like feature, but I'll talk about that in the summary, since technically Sentinel was a valid feat choice that we could have taken and maybe should have. We also have extra attack, so now our attack action gives us 3, our Nick property gives us a 4th, once per turn of course, and our dual wielder feat also gives us a 5th bonus action attack. That's just 5 attacks, all with advantage from Reckless every single turn. It's very nice consistent damage. The final thing that can be neat to play around with as well is from Fighter 9, and that is Tactical Mastery. Tactical Mastery lets us swap out the weapon mastery properties of any weapons that we have for either push, slow, or sap. We literally don't need sap, probably, given that we're going to be marking every enemy we hit. We don't want to push them because we want them to stay within 5 feet of us. So really, we're just going to trigger the Nick Mastery once, and then every single hit afterwards, we're going to use the slow mastery. This won't be stellar if we're just fighting one big enemy, but if we're fighting a lot of little ones, we can walk up, unwavering mark them, which just gives them disadvantage, slow them so it's harder for them to get away. We have Hold the Line in case they actually do try to get away, or we have defensive feats as well if they decide to just stand and attack us instead, and we don't think we can take all those hits. Also, you could either be tankier to try and take those hits, or you could give all your allies advantage on all of those enemies. And other than that, that's the build. It's time to summarize what we have. We are a Talenta Halfling, and even though we don't have a Clawfoot built into the build, we have a lot of extra features and bonuses that accounts for us being mounted. If we are mounted, well, we're going to have a mount to control that could potentially help in combat as well, or at the very least gives us a lot of extra mobility so we can get around the battlefield hitting multiple enemies on a turn. Really, what we want to do is walk up to one big group of enemies, hit all of them a little bit, and then apply that unwavering mark to each of them while standing next to them to actually tank for our party. But if you wanted to just be an aggressive damage dealer, having mobility to go up and hit the boss a whole bunch of times and then get away could technically work. Opportunity attacks don't really matter if we're mounted, since we have veer and we can just have the enemies attack us instead. As well, Hold the Line came online really late. If you would have rather picked up Sentinel instead, then I would definitely swap out either Defensive Duelist or Mage Slayer. Even those feats came a little later anyways, but it still would be the appropriate time to probably swap out Sentinel, since we wanted Mountain Combatant for thematic reasons, and we wanted Dual Wielder for damage on our turn. Overall, I do feel like the build feels like a solid damage dealer or tank, and can be played either aggressively or more supportive and defensively. And I'm not too disappointed about not baking in the Clawfoot to our build, given that, number one, we might not always be in a spot where we want to have that Clawfoot mount. We might be in a dungeon or a tight corridor or somewhere where it would just get in the way. Also, going back to the designer's intent with the Cavalier Fighter, they made it so that you could have features that worked both on your mount and off your mount, and that's the way I feel this character should work. If we're nothing without the mount, then we shouldn't have it. Other than that, let me know what you thought of the build or how you would go about creating a Talenta Halfling. If you would try to bake in the Clawfoot mount or some other dinosaur perhaps, whether you went Beastmaster Ranger or as a Paladin with Fine Steed, or how you would just do a Barbarian Fighter Halfling in general. Thank you so much for coming on the journey with me, and I hope to see you in the next one.